Have you here. So tonight, I want to talk about a theme that I think pervades the Buddha's teachings. And it is that the distinction between the circumstances we find ourselves in and our relationship to those circumstances. So I don't know if anybody else has noticed that, but it sure feels like there's a lot of anger and combativeness in our world right now. And there are a lot of opinions about why that's true, but that's not the topic of tonight's talk. The topic of tonight's talk is how we can relate to that truth skillfully. So when we think about the circumstances, talking about circumstances and our relationship to them, when we think about the circumstances of a monastic, a nun or a monk who's chosen to renounce all of their worldly possessions, to restrict their food intake to a few hours a day, and to renounce romantic relationships, most types of entertainment. To a lot of people, this sounds like a life of great deprivation. And sometimes people find themselves in those circumstances unwillingly, maybe through poverty, a variety of things, illness. And so for those people, it may well be experienced as a life of deprivation. But to those who undertake this life voluntarily, for most of them, they seem to be very content. It seems to be a happy life. And so the point is, the circumstances are the same, but the relationship to the circumstances, that's what differs. Some of you who've participated in residential meditation retreats can probably relate to this. No doubt your friends and family were puzzled, and they reacted as though you were somehow being deprived and subjected to something terrible. But for those of us who attend the retreats, usually we can't wait to get there. Same circumstances, different relationship. And it's much more, this truth is much more pervasive than just monks and nuns and retreats. It really affects every moment of our lives. You know, one thing that I can remember before I began meditating, when I would bump my head on the kitchen cabinet, for example, I would have this flush of anger. I don't know who it would have been directed to. I just know it was anger. And nowadays, when I do that, which I still do, after that instant of shock wears off, what I'm most aware of is laughing at the whole thing, which feels so much more wonderful than being overcome with anger, to just be able to look at it and think, isn't this a silly situation? Why didn't I close the cabinet before I stood up? So it's easy to see where people are reacting strongly to their circumstances. There are a lot of strong opinions on all sides about our upcoming elections. And many people seem to think that the possibility of whoever they support losing and their opponent winning will be the end of the world as we know it. And it can feel that way. Also, there are strong opinions about the treatment of racial minorities, particularly black and brown people, by the law enforcement establishment. So are these protests an overdue expression of resistance to an unjust system? or are they an effort to destabilize society? People with strong opinions on both sides of that. And there are also strong opinions about how to respond to COVID-19, this global pandemic. Should the schools reopen, and if so, how? What about businesses? Should face coverings be mandated, or is that an infringement of somebody's personal liberties? There's no shortage of examples where we've got strong emotional reactions going right now. And I just want to give a couple of brief news reports, several, about face coverings, because that's really been startling, I think. So a 17-year-old employee of Sesame Place, a children's theme park just outside Philadelphia, was punched in the face by a man and a woman Sunday after he reminded them to wear masks while in the park. Another 17-year-old working as a Chili's hostess in Baton Rouge was assaulted after several would-be diners attacked her when she told a large party of 13 they could not be seated together due to social distancing guidelines. She reportedly had to go to the emergency room and receive stitches. A woman hit a gate agent in Phoenix at the airport terminal Wednesday after American Airlines staff barred her from her flight connection because she refused to cover her face on the flight. An incident unfolded Thursday between a 77-year-old man in Lansing who reportedly wore a mask and an unmasked 43-year-old attacker. The two exchanged words in the parking lot of a Lansing grocery store before the Lansing man was stabbed. And finally, a Family Dollar store security guard who was killed in Flint, Michigan on Friday was shot after telling a customer that her child had to wear a face mask to enter the store. And so far, I've just used examples of violence perpetrated by those who don't wear face masks, but it would be a mistake to believe they're the only ones that are attached to their views on the subject. Just this week, I found myself confronting a contractor. He was working in our condo building without the mask that's required. And our building doesn't have staff, so enforcing the rules is up to the residents. And I was courteous and respectful, but I was also firm. And he was clearly irritated by my request that he wear a mask. And afterwards, I found myself wondering how much of my speaking up was because of my desire for safety, and how much of it was really not my desire, but the attachment to my desire, not my circumstances, but my relationship to my circumstances. So when we experience a rush of strong emotion, it can really be difficult to sort out what's happening in that moment. Even meditators, trained observers of the mind, can easily get lost in reactivity. And it's not surprising that those who have not chosen this path of mind training are at the whim of ever-changing emotional urges. So the key element in understanding the mind's tendencies toward reactivity is knowing the difference between our desires and our attachment to our desires. Our culture really doesn't make this distinction. As to tonight's topic, our circumstances can be understood to be related to our desires. So you can kind of think of those two as interchangeable. Circumstances and relationship to circumstances, desire and relationship to desire. When we first look at it, it can be surprising that this rush of strong emotion is really a conflation of the two happening simultaneously. But as we look more closely over time, we can begin to distinguish between the two. And for most of us, that is a natural evolution on this path of investigation and training that is insight meditation. So the Buddha taught that we should cultivate an attitude of equanimity around our circumstances. So what is equanimity, and how is that going to help us? One definition is it's a state of psychological stability and composure which is undisturbed by experience or of exposure to strong emotions, pain, or other phenomena. Another way it's sometimes described in the insight meditation tradition is a state of neither favoring nor opposing one's circumstances. And you'll also hear the term disenchantment sometimes when describing equanimity. Now, being disenchanted can have a kind of a negative connotation in our culture, but let's look a little more closely. To become disenchanted is really to emerge from a state of enchantment, to be liberated from a state of enchantment, of being under a spell. And as we emerge, we see the object of our enchantment more clearly, and it no longer has the magical power over us that it once had. We are no longer ruled by our desire for this object. Here are a couple lines from Philip Moffat's book, Dancing with Life. When you cling to desire, you become defined by that desire. You see the world through the eyes of someone who wants that particular goal or outcome. It is a distorted vision. Therefore, you measure your life incorrectly. You experience anxiety, stress, dissatisfaction, tension, and frustrated longing. The mind is so contracted around what it is craving that it acts as though getting this one thing would make you happy. Oftentimes, the goal, even if achieved, provides only fleeting satisfaction and is quickly replaced by another, and the cycle starts over again. So when we cultivate equanimity, we're cultivating a state where we won't be whipped around by our desires. Equanimity figures very promptly in the Buddha's teachings. It is the 10th of the 10 paramis or perfections that we're encouraged to cultivate on this path. It is the final or 4th of the Brahma Viharas or divine abodes, which are wholesome mind states in which we are encouraged to abide. It is the final or the 5th of the 5 jhana factors. These are characteristics used to cultivate states of deep concentration. And it is the final or the 7th of the 7 awakening factors, which are characteristics that when cultivated lead one on to awakening. You really can't find yourself in much better company than that. When they first encounter the Buddha's teaching on equanimity, some people misunderstand it to be surrender to whatever conditions exist. So this incorrect understanding would have an abused spouse stay in an abusive relationship, or it would have a disadvantaged person accept racial and economic inequity without objection. But really nothing could be further from the truth. The Buddha's life would have been much easier if he had declined to teach the Dharma and had simply pursued his spiritual practice. So there's a story, it's a little bit mythological, but I'll just tell it quickly. He's just reached awakening, and he's looking around and he's thinking, well, what am I going to do now? And he thinks, well, maybe I should teach this. Maybe this would be useful to others. And then he thinks, man, that is going to be a drag. People are not going to want to hear it, and it's just going to be a miserable life. I'm not doing that. And so here's where it gets a little magical. One of the devas comes down and talks to him and says, this is so important. There are those with little dust in their eyes. That is to say, there are those who are close to being able to see these truths, and they just need somebody to point them in the right direction. And so the Deva prevails on Buddha, and he spends the next 45 years of his life teaching what he has discovered. And what he was doing when he was teaching is he was trying to influence the world for the better. So his state of equanimity coexisted very comfortably with an active effort for 45 years to influence what was happening in the world. The Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, the sixth factor is right action, and it speaks directly to us applying ourselves to bring about change. It includes what are referred to as the four great efforts, and these are preventing the arising of unarisen, unwholesome states, keeping unwholesome states from arising. Secondly, abandoning the arising of risen unwholesome states. So when unwholesome states have arisen, eradicating them. The third is arousing unarisen wholesome states, bringing into existence wholesome states that are not there. And the fourth is maintaining arisen wholesome states. So that is sustaining wholesome states once they arise. That, if you take this on as a practice, you'll figure out that it couldn't be any farther away from passively accepting your conditions. So abiding in equanimity doesn't prevent us from working actively for wholesome change in the world. Now that doesn't answer all the questions. When we engage with the world, that just opens the can of worms. Now we've got all kinds of questions we have to answer. How do we strike an appropriate balance between our work for change in the world and the inner work, the practice of investigation that'll support progress on the path? They don't always exist comfortably side by side. Or how do we choose which causes we're going to apply our limited resources to? Or what about compromise? Do we accept an imperfect outcome because it's progress, or do we hold fast for the perfect outcome? There are all kinds of questions we're left with. But one of the questions we're not left with is, should we just be passive? The answer to that is no. So returning to the issue of our circumstances and our relationship to them, where does this leave us? We cultivate the ability to change the circumstances that we can, and then to accept with equanimity those that we can't change at this time. The good news is we can parse out those things. We can figure out what is my circumstance and what is my relationship to my circumstance. We can begin to get a foot in the door and understand how to relate to that. And the desire that motivates us to bring about wholesome change is a part of this path. And I want to close with a quote from Thanissaro Bhikkhu, where he speaks to wholesome desire. He says, we're taught that the Buddha gave only one role to desire as the cause of suffering. Because he says to abandon the cause of suffering, it sounds like he's denying any positive role for desire. Unskillful desire is the cause of suffering. Skillful desire forms part of the path to the cessation of suffering. So I will offer those thoughts for your consideration. And we will have a question and answer period, such as it is on Zoom. Tonight we're going to do something slightly different. We have always used the chat function for people to be able to chat in questions, and that is still available. If you know how to use the Zoom chat function and you want to chat in a question, please feel free. In addition, there is a way to raise your hand, and it's not like this. This is not what I'm talking about. There is a Zoom feature to raise your hand, and it wouldn't be a good use of our time for me to try to give a primer on it. But if you know how to use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you want to use that, feel free to use it, and I'll unmute you and you can speak your question. Either chat or Zoom hand raise, either one of those are just fine. All right, this will be a test. I see that Steve has asked to be unmuted. So Steve, see if that allows you to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me? All right. I've been growing in equanimity, and that's a wonderful thing, but there's also advocates for developing one's shadow so that one can be assertive and not be taken advantage of. What are your thoughts on developing shadow as opposed to developing equanimity?
I think they have to go hand in hand. I think both are essential. I guess in a sense, it's kind of the middle path of not surrendering totally to one or the other. And it's a delicate balance in the moment. You know, am I compromising my equanimity to take a stand here and kind of resist the conditions that are present? I will agree. Well, I will say that I think both are present. As to striking the balance, I think it's a matter of discernment. Most often we will not get it exactly right. We'll be a little bit over here, and then we'll correct, and we'll be a little bit too far over here. But over time, our ability to discern the correct balance becomes stronger. So I hope that speaks to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. All right. Looks like so here's a question from Marty. Will you talk more about attachment to strong feelings that one is right and someone else is wrong? Well, I don't want to act like I know the right answer to that, but I think it's again, I think it's delicate. I think it's always wise to be questioning things we believe are certain. Um, so some of you have heard this. I'll tell just a quick story. Some of you have heard this story. So this is about two monks, Ajahn Sumedho, who was a young monk, and Ajahn Chah, who was a senior monk. And one of the other monks had left the monastery on a trip and had become converted to conservative Christianity and had come back to the monastery and was trying to convert all the monks to conservative Christianity. And Ajahn Sumedho had some friends coming to the monastery, and he went and talked to the senior monk, Ajahn Chah, and he said, what are we going to do about this? We can't have this guy running around trying to convert everybody to Christianity. That's embarrassing. And Ajahn Chah thought about it for a minute, and he said, well, maybe he's right. So even though he was a senior, dedicated Theravadan monk, he was willing to entertain the possibility that he was not right about everything. So attachment to strong feelings that one is right and someone else is wrong. I think the key word in the question is attachment. Kind of one of the universal truths, if I can use that term, in the Buddhist teachings is attachment brings with it suffering. And so if we see attachment to anything, even wholesome things, it's going to have a cause and effect relationship. So I would be suspicious of attachment. I'm not free of attachment, but when I can identify it, I'm suspicious of it. So Marty, I hope that helps. Okay, Sarah wants to know, can you provide a practical example of cultivating equanimity? For example, I end up suppressing anger or another strong emotion when trying to cultivate equanimity. So the second part of the second statement you make, you end up suppressing anger or another strong emotion when trying to cultivate equanimity. I would say it takes time. Our relationship with equanimity matures over time. But if we are suppressing anger or another strong emotion, if we're suppressing an emotion, then that is not fertile ground for feeling equanimity, feeling equanimous. A different way to be in relationship with that would be to not suppress, but recognize the arising of the strong emotion, to allow it to be true, not judge ourselves for that feeling, not condemn ourselves. A feeling is never incorrect. A feeling is just true. It's just like whether the sky is cloudy or clear, it's not wrong or right. So it might be unwholesome, and we might try to cultivate a mind that moves to that feeling less in the future. But in the moment, it's not right or wrong. And if we're suppressing it, then it's not going to serve us well. So I think the way to be in relationship with that strong emotion is to know what's true. And as we see that it's not useful, our attachment to it will diminish and we can cultivate equanimity more successfully. That's probably not going to do the trick, but I hope that helps a little bit. Okay. I think our time for questions and answers is up. We do have a few announcements. On Wednesday, September 2nd, which I think is, excuse me, 2 weeks from tonight, Denise Owens, who is one of our Dharma leaders in training, will be our leader that night. So that'll be something worth putting on your calendar and tuning in for. This fall's book discussion is being held on Zoom. It begins on Thursday, September 3rd. The book is Deep Hope, and it's led by Joy. Her contact information is on the website. If I'm not mistaken, the group is full, but she's accepting. Joy's trying to tell me something. If I could, hold on. Just give me one moment. There.
Yes, there's now one opening on that September 3rd book discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joy. So there's one opening on that. Rush to your computer and send Joy an email. And then there's a second fall book discussion via Zoom. A new book by Sharon Salzberg called Real Change begins on October 7th. We'll meet the first Wednesday of each month through December. For 4 weeks in October, beginning October 6th, I'll be offering a 4-week Zoom series on the basics of insight meditation. Again, the information's on the website. That is not full. If you are relatively new to insight meditation, this is a great way to get some depth. If you want a refresher and if you've never taken this, even though you've been practicing for a while, it can be very useful. So I invite you to participate in that if it interests you. Our website is imccharlotte.org. Keep your eye on that for other upcoming events. This is where I would normally say if we were in person, there's a Dana box at the back of the room, Dana being generosity. If you would like to support this community financially, the website has a link where you can donate. And the last announcement I'm going to make, it used to be when we met in person, so let me say that we offer from 7 to 7:30 every Wednesday an instruction period. And when we met in person, we would greet you at the front door and we would say, "Are you new?" And if you said yes, we would direct you there. And our attendance there was always very strong. The attendance for that instruction session has not been as strong since we've been on Zoom, probably in part because new people come, but maybe they aren't aware of that. So we're kind of redoubling our efforts to make sure that newer people know that the instruction period is available at 7 o'clock. It's a separate Zoom link. We encourage you, if you're new to insight meditation, to take advantage of the instruction period. It will undoubtedly help you move along in the practice. And so we encourage you to take advantage of that. Okay. We will now close with our loving kindness or metta practice. So finding a comfortable posture. Closing your eyes. And before we begin, we'll just take a moment and bring to mind anyone, any being that you would like to have held in loving kindness tonight. Could be a human being, could be a non-human being, could be a group, could be a nation, could be a family. And then we'll begin our loving kindness practice with ourselves. I'll offer phrases that you can repeat silently to yourself. May I be safe from inner and outer harm. May I be happy and content. May I be healthy in body and mind. And may I live a life of well-being, free from suffering. Then we'll call to mind a being or beings that we'd like to have held in metta and loving kindness. And we'll include here all of the beings that each of you called to mind earlier. May you be safe from inner and outer harm. May you be happy and content. May you be healthy in body and mind. And may you live a life of well-being, free from suffering. And finally, broadening our loving kindness, our metta practice out to all beings everywhere. May all beings be safe from inner and outer harm. May all beings be happy and content. May all beings be healthy in body and mind. And may all beings, without exception, live lives free from suffering. So, have a lovely week.